Now, what about the styling? What about these buttons? Now, for these buttons, you might notice that you now have a strange behavior if you rotate back to portrait mode. Also here on Android. On the other hand, if we change something and undo that just so that the app restarts and we start in portrait mode, you see it looks good, but now if we go to landscape mode, it looks bad again. So basically, the width of our buttons gets locked in when the app starts and doesn't adjust when our screen size changes. And of course, it changes when we rotate the device because width and height get swapped. So we have more width available if we're in landscape mode than we have in portrait mode. The problem is that currently, on the start game screen, when we set the width of our buttons, which we do down there, we use dimensions get. And that's very important to keep in mind, this is only calculated when your app starts. So when the app starts for the first time, this has a look at the available width, and if it starts in portrait mode, that's the portrait mode width. If it starts in landscape mode, it's the landscape mode width, and it locks this in. And when you then rotate the device, this doesn't recalculate. Now, of course, you would want this to recalculate, and there is a simple fix for that. If you have a width or height, anything you get from dimensions, which should respect orientation changes, so which should recalculate when the orientation changes, then you should not use dimensions width down there in your style sheet, but instead you need to manage the width or whatever property it is that can change dynamically and that should re-render the UI when it changes with state. So here in the start game screen, we already have use state. We can now also manage our button width here, set button width with use state, and initialize this to dimensions get window width divided by 4, which is the default I start with. Now you can set up a listener here on dimensions instead of using get by calling add event listener, and listen to the change event, which fires whenever the dimensions change, which typically is the case when the user rotates the device. So here we can set up a function, update layout, for example, which is a function which I call set button width, and well, set it again to my width here, but the dimensions width will be different based on the width of the screen when we rotate it. And it's this function which I want to call here. So it's update layout, which I want to call here without parentheses here, because we just want to point at this function so that it's called for us when the dimensions change. And this will make sure that this reruns whenever our dimensions change, and therefore this component will re-render. Now we just have to make sure we use that dynamically recalculated button width state here. We can do this by using inline styles instead of a style sheet object. Now, if you had other styles set up for the button, which do not depend on the dimensions, then you could leave them here in the style sheet, of course. In this case, I don't have that though, so I'll just comment this out. And you could then merge that with some inline styles. Here, since we have no default other styles, I'll just replace this style sheet object we're pointing at with the inline style object, where I set width equal to button width, and do the same, of course, for my second button. With that, we now have styling that changes whenever we rotate the device. So if we save this, you'll see this now looks good no matter how we rotate this, also on Android, because this gets re-rendered. Now, one important note here though, right now at the moment, I'm setting up a bunch of event listeners here. I always add a new event listener whenever this component re-renders, and that's not what I want to do. And we can use effect, which is also built into React and which you should be aware of, to have code that we run whenever our component re-renders. So now I can use effect here, and the function which I want to run on every re-render is a function which in the end creates this update layout function here and adds my event listener. So I'll cut this and add it here in the use effect function. And if we then return something here in useEffect, that's our cleanup function, which runs right before useEffect runs. And there I want to clean up my listener, because here I can then call dimensions remove event listener change for update layout. So now we clean this up and set up a new one when our component re-renders. Clean up the old one, set up a new one. And therefore, we always only have one running event listener. If we do it like this, that's simply cleaner. And therefore, if we now save this and we go back, we have the same behavior as before, but now in a clean way by utilizing use state and use effect, and most importantly, the event listening capabilities of the Dimensions API, which allow us to not only set dimensions once, but recalculate them when they change.